7 defeats in their last 8 games. The latest last night at Anfield. 4-2, Liverpool beat them, and Liverpool go 3 points clear at the top of the table. Good for Liverpool, but what about Newcastle? This was Eddie Howe post-match.
It's the Premier League and there's no easy games no matter who you play, as we found that in recent weeks. I think the only way to get out of the run of form we're in is to win, and you're only going to do that if you're together and committed, and that commitment was there. And as I said earlier, as long as we see that, we know we'll be fine.
As long as we see that, we know we'll be fine. Is it too ridiculous a notion, Simon, to think that the dial has now turned on Eddie and he's under severe pressure?
Yes, it shouldn't be at this stage. I mean, I maintain the view, and I've said it for some time, that I don't think he'll get them to the Holy Grail. But that's a different discussion than suggesting he should be taken out of his job now because they're on a run of form which is not where you would have expected Newcastle to be. Can you attribute it to playing 6 extra games at the beginning of this season? Can you attribute it to emotional overload by the expectation of Newcastle fans and the frenzy that becomes St James's Park?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I think the Newcastle fans are a 12th man. I think they add impetus to the club. I was surprised. I watched Newcastle. I'm surprised they've gone off the boil. I'm surprised at the way they played last night because as much as Liverpool were compelling, Newcastle were poor, and 4-2 flattered them. You know, I know that Sky do their very best job to sell it as a legacy fixture, but Liverpool battered them. Liverpool had 34 shots on goal. They battered them. And Newcastle, and they look, you know, Guimaraes looks like he's running in treacle. You know, the only player on the pitch that's got anything about him at this moment in time seems to be, well, it's 2 players, Livramento and Anthony Gordon. Isak is a great finisher, and perhaps, you know, Darwin Núñez can have a look at what he does. But I'm surprised. But I believe that it's absolutely right that Eddie Howe has more than...
enough credit in the bank.
Well, of course he bloody does. Of course he does.
Yeah, you've repeatedly said before, even before they went in this run, it wasn't your thought, not in your thinking, that Eddie is the man to take them to the major prizes.
Yes, but I didn't think they were going to get to the major prizes anytime soon, because they might have been an irresistible force, but they were coming up against immovable objects. In terms of the Manchester Cities and Arsenal's, Liverpools of the world, it was a big ask. They were remarkably unlucky in that Champions League group. Remarkably unlucky.
And he got them there in his first season of asking.
And he got them there way above what people's expectations of them were. They were a brilliant side to watch last year. Everything about Newcastle, from their buying policy through to the manner in which the manager communicated to the media. Again, I wish, you know, I hadn't written the article 4 or 5 weeks ago because he hasn't won a game since. But the point is he doesn't go from being a very capable operator to being a poor one overnight. Now, the players, look, again, they were describing them as leggy last night. With due respect to them, I can't really understand why. They've got players that are injured, so is everybody else. Some of the games that they've lost are games that you have to look back on and think, I know Luton will give people a run for their money. They give Chelsea a run for their money, and they're an honest, decent side. But when you're losing games to people like Luton, and in this run of
Forest at home,
yeah, these are poor games to be losing in. And what I was surprised last night was it was like day and night between Newcastle 4 or 5 weeks ago that was so energetic, so vibrant, so much on the front foot, to a Newcastle side that got battered from the first whistle. And Liverpool will say it was down to them, and a big proportion of it was. But also another proportion of it was that Newcastle gave Liverpool nothing to think about for the first 30-odd minutes of the game, where the pattern of play was determined by Liverpool and Newcastle being so off it. He'll get them together. Who have they got next? They've got Sunderland in the FA Cup. They need not to lose that game because that's a pride thing. That gives people energy. They'll play Man City after that, which I suspect they'll have difficulty getting anything out of that game.
Yeah.
But I'm surprised, but I'm also confident. And going to the point that you were making, I've never laid a claim that Eddie Howe should be sacked. I've said on the Newcastle United Express, the idea that Amanda Staveley will come out after a cup final and suggest that what's coming down the track is Champions League wins, Premier League wins. I've always maintained that it might be a challenge for Eddie Howe, however capable he is, and clearly he's a capable operator. Clearly 95% of the decisions that he's made since he walked through the door have been the right ones, from who they've bought to how they've sold them. Buy Chris Wood, gets a few goals from, gets them out of a bit of a problem at the beginning of his tenure. He flogs them on to someone else, gets his money back. He buys decent players. People can make the argument about Tonelli and the due diligence. That's not his job to do due diligence.
Yeah.
It's the people's job that sign the players and to make sure that everything behind it is supported.
In the Premier League, they've won 9 and 20. They've lost 9 and 20.
Yeah, poor at the moment.
If they lose to Sunderland in the FA Cup, will the Saudi ownership not think, I wonder if we've got the right guy in charge now for the longer term?
It depends how focused they are on it, and depends really and truly what they think of the job that he's done so far. I think you've got to give him a score report, which was an A+ up until November and the beginning of December. And in recent times, it's obviously dropped off the radar.
But having been top 4 last season, they've got to be top 6 this.
Well, again,
that's a minimum requirement.
I maintained the view that it was going to be very difficult for them in a season where they had the Champions League. I mean, they were so close in that Champions League. They battered PSG in the first game, which I thought was about PSG not turning up. But they went to Paris and they were bleeding unlucky not to get a result there.
True.
They were cheated out of it by a poor penalty.
But
they hit a crossbar.
Fine margins, though, Simon. I mean, we know that at that level.
But that fine margins put them bottom of their Champions League group, which is not reflective of their performance in the Champions League group.
But it wasn't fine margins at St James's Park when they lost 3-1 to Chris Wood and Nottingham Forest.
No, it wasn't. And it wasn't fine margins when they got beat 4-1 by Tottenham. And it wasn't fine margins in other games. And it wasn't fine margins last night. They've lost their way. And now this is the first test. This is the second test. The first test was to get indoor, establish himself, which he did in no short order. And now his second test really is how do I overcome this mini bump in the road? It's 7 games. The story's being built up. People are starting to potentially write my obituary, and now I've got to have a second wind, and it must start at Sunderland. It must start at Sunderland.
I told you when they lost to Manchester United in the final of the Carabao Cup at Wembley. Before I spoke to Amanda Staveley that day when she famously said we will win the 4 big ones, I spoke to the chairman of Liverpool, the Saudi chairman of Newcastle, who said to me, "We're already at the next stage. We're at the next stage." Are they at the next stage this morning?
Well, they are in people's minds because the expectation is there. Newcastle are on. If you're talking about what they're achieving in the minds of people that perceive them to be a force to be reckoned with, they're already in that conversation because people are now looking at Newcastle going, "Hang on a second, what's going on here? This is a problem." And realistically speaking, to be in a situation where people think it's a problem, you must have achieved something quite significant to be in that conversation.
Yeah.
They always set themselves a high bar by getting into the Champions League, and they deserve to be in the Champions League, and they deserve to be in European football for the rest of this season, because to finish bottom of the group where they've been so close and the margins were so small.
Yeah.
But it may be the 6 games in the Champions League that they've taken it out of their legs. It may be that it's a bit after the Lord Mayor show, but they need to get their boots back on.
It's key moments. So last night, the Jota penalty, Eddie Howe mentioned it briefly.
It's key moments. Liverpool battered them.
Is it a fine line though between a dive and exaggerating contact?
That was a dive. That wasn't any fine line. It was poor officiating. It was a poor on-field decision, and it was an even poorer VAR decision. And that, to me, I mean, Klopp would have been demented if that had happened at the other end. Yeah. Because it wasn't a penalty. Yeah. It wasn't a penalty.
And, of course, Klopp didn't mention it last night.
Well, it's not his job to mention it, is it? He's, ultimately, we're not expecting, and we only expect managers to criticise.
But that was at 3-2, right? That was at 3-2.
But I mean, Liverpool.
Yeah, but you never can tell. Botman had opened the door again, hadn't he?
Well, he had, but realistically speaking, how he'd managed to do it and how Newcastle got themselves into situations where they contributed virtually nothing to the game besides waiting for something to happen to them. And the best player on the pitch was Dubravka. I mean, they talk about needing a goalkeeper. He's doing a job, isn't he? If anyone gets an unfair shake of the stick, it'll be him, because he kept him in the game 10, 11 saves, didn't he?
Newcastle fans, what do you think? There's Nathan, a big Newcastle fan. If Eddie is under pressure, the world's gone mad. Nothing has gone his way this season. I cannot believe I'm hearing that any Newcastle fan out there may shout for Eddie's head. Are any of you doing that? Surely not. But if you are, then tell us why.
Don't tell us nothing's gone his way this season, because everyone has the same shake of the stick.
If you fancy coming to air, we're here for you. Newcastle fans, 03717 223344.
Jim White and Simon Jordan. Monday to Friday mornings from 10 on AM, on DAB, via the TalkSPORT app and on your smart speaker. TalkSPORT.